This episode of AD History is brought to you by listeners like you, contributing through the crowdfunding platform Patreon. Learn more about how you can support the show by visiting patreon.com/AD History Podcast and the exclusive benefits that await you for your generous support. Join us in the effort to keep creating the AD history you deserve by visiting patreon.com/AD History Podcast. Thank you. Have you ever wondered what really happened at the Council of Nicaea, or how India's golden age began? Well, have we got a story for you.
This is the AD History Podcast, weaving a tapestry of world history from 1AD to HD. Powered by TGNR. Get your good news that's real news at TGNR by visiting tgnreview.com. Now here are your hosts, Paul K. DiCostanzo and Patrick Foote.
And brought to you via London and New York City, you are listening to the AD History Podcast. I am Paul K. DiCostanzo, and I am joined by my co-host, Patrick Foote. Patrick, we got a big show ahead of us today, but one thing you and I are going to have a long talk about, a very serious talk about, is that you traveled all the way across the Atlantic, first time in New York City, and where did you eat? A bloody Olive Garden. The breadstick defense shall not save you.
Those breadsticks are super tasty. That is correct, Paul. Yes, but why'd you bring it up right now? That was about like that was actually, you know what, Paul? I reckon 3 years ago, to this day of recording, we were probably in New York. Hence why, is that why you're mentioning it now? I was in New York, maybe even having dinner with you this very time 3 years ago. We were discussing.
It may very well be exactly that 3-year anniversary. Good on you, my friend. No, the reason I bring it up now is because I stumbled across a video you dropped recently where you were answering questions. I think it was, can the internet guess my name or something like that?
Yes.
And you mentioned it in there, and I thought to myself, oh, goodness. Oh, no. I was talking to my wife this morning, and I said, I don't know. I'm not sure that I can vouch for him to St. Peter anymore. So, no, we'll have a long talk about that.
All I will say is, if you're in the UK, you have a very specific image of what a breadstick is in your mind. It's like a piece of cardboard. It's a very thin, long piece of cardboard, more or less. An Olive Garden breadstick is like a soft, little, doughy loaf of goodness. I'm sure you guys in America are sick to death of them. My God, when Olive Garden offered me breadsticks, I was like, yeah, okay, I'll try some of those breadsticks. And I was blown away. So call me a heretic, expel me from the podcast, but gosh, I will defend
we will not be
breadsticks
expelling
to
you,
the grave.
But you are being chastised. You are being chastised.
Shamed.
Well, no, not shamed, but just simply chastised. I don't believe in shaming. But so today we actually have an extremely interesting episode. We have a Patreon submitted question, which is a really interesting hypothetical question that we were given. But today in the first segment, I'm going to be discussing the famed, though very poorly understood in many cases, First Council of Nicaea. And you, my friend, in the third and final segment, are going to be discussing something that we kind of teased in a way in our What We Missed episode, because we had to catch up for it because of everything we did in the 3rd century. But it's something where the biggest thrust of history happened now, which of course is truly the founding of the incredible Gupta Empire on the Indian subcontinent. And I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing it with you guys. It was very, very interesting to read into and just seeing. And it's great to catch up with India. We haven't really looked all that much into India in this podcast, but to see where India is and where it was and where it's going is darn fascinating. It really sort of starts here.
We kind of touch on it in certain points.
Yeah.
This is great because we get to focus on it heavy duty. So with all of that out of the way, let's lay down our necessary, obligatory, now legendary AD History Podcast ground rules. 1. Evaluate events in the context they occurred. 2. Over the span of recorded history, the way it was recorded, its methodology, and the facts that are important have changed immensely. How we view history today is not necessarily how we viewed it 50 years ago. 3. Nothing in history was inevitable. And 4. History and the past is like a different country.
So, Paul, back again, Emperor Constantine, he is turning that empire to Christianity one way or another, bit by bit. And this is a major step, it would seem, in that conversion of the empire. So, Paul, could you please talk to us about the First Council of Nicaea?
Of course. And I think it is best to set the scene. As we so exclusively and at great length talked about Constantine's rise to power, and by this point what's becoming the consolidation of the entire power, not just the West but the East as well, we're beginning to see how Constantine began to influence Christianity very directly in ways that have profound impact to this day. In fact, something that's interesting about Constantine, even though he was very new to Christianity, he was very much involving himself in various matters of the church from pretty early on, and this would continue throughout his rule. And in 325 AD, a very, very fascinating event happened, one that has become known, thanks to Dan Brown, to a great many people, but is very poorly understood, unfortunately. And this, of course, is what we know today as the First Council of Nicaea, that was called by Constantine to help achieve a greater doctrinal understanding of the Christological nature of Jesus. And it lasted from May to August 325 and was held in Asia Minor, aka Turkey, in the settlement of Nicaea. And basically there were two things that this particular council was seeking to create a greater common understanding about in regards to Jesus and the nature of divinity and Jesus. And it really boils down to this. Was he the same as God, or was he separate from God? These are the major questions that they sought to hash out. Nicaea was the first of the initial 7 ecumenical councils that occurred over the next 3 centuries, concluding with, quite appropriately, the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, all of which were intended to hash out some greater matter of Christianity or another. And when we say ecumenical, that's with really good purpose, because in this case, ecumenical means involving numerous churches in this case. So there wasn't just one church, even at this time. There were many different followings and sects and all of these different elements of Christianity by the time of the early 4th century, and you're trying to bring them all together. And so naturally, in this case, when we're going forward, it said that roughly 1,800 bishops were invited from across the empire, but obviously not all of them were able to attend, but quite a few did, though we do not have an exact number.
And Paul, you just mentioned earlier Christology. What exactly is that? Christology, apologies, Christology. What exactly is that?
That's really what's at the heart of the matter here, interestingly enough. So more or less by definition, Christology, simply put, is the theological study and sometimes debate of the divine nature of Jesus himself. Hence, it is the major point of contention for this particular council.
And so is that the main reason why Constantine called this council? He thought we needed to figure out what's going on with this religion and just kind of solidify everything about it. You see, there are so many different sects of it. By the 4th century, it was all up in so many places. It seems that Constantine wanted to call this council to try and solidify things.
More or less, we're looking for some clarification here, which on paper is a wonderful idea. In practicality, that's something that's obviously extremely difficult. And it's important to note, even though the Council of Nicaea did come to certain conclusions, it's also important to note that it by no means settled the debate on this. So you figure it makes sense, though, too, because Constantine at this point, as we discussed, is still relatively new to Christianity, right? And in his being new to Christianity, from just a very logical point from which to proceed, this seems like something you would really want to get a better grasp on, right?
Yeah, and something that's really coming to my mind for me when reading this is we've got such a set idea of what exactly Christianity is to us that it's kind of crazy to think that this sort of council had to happen to try and solidify what exactly that is. Because to me and you, we have a pretty good understanding of what exactly Christianity is. Sure, there's different sects of it. You've got Protestantism, Orthodoxy, Catholicism at this day, but we understand, but to go to a point in time when that wasn't set in stone yet, and we've talked about this in the past with previous episodes when we talked about the writing of the Gospels and that early version of the New Testament, I forget its name exactly, and it's just another friendly reminder that Christianity just didn't come to the party fully prepared. It took a long while to get to what it became.
I believe you're referring to the Diatessaron, correct?
The Diatessaron. I know it was a big confusing word, and it's just a great example of how Christianity wasn't just this thing from the get-go. It wasn't all of a sudden Jesus died in 33 AD and boom, Christianity happened. It took a long time to get to where it is.
It absolutely did. And the whole concept around Christ and Christ's divinity, honestly, is something that has not even come to a common understanding to this day. And to some extent, it's almost somewhat pointless in a way to try to suss it out, even in modern terms, certainly, because Christianity has gone in so many directions over 2,000 years now. There are so many different elements that believe certain aspects of it that don't necessarily concur with other followings and their understanding of it. So, but we're still early on, and they're at the very least trying to come to this matter. And it made sense in the case of Constantine to say, hey, we probably should try and figure this out. So that does make sense insofar as it goes.
So, but how did all these other church leaders exactly feel about Constantine's intervention to call this council? Like, would not seen as him interfering with the church?
Ooh, well, you know what? They're in an interesting position, as I understand it. First off, from what I can tell, they seem to be a bit overwhelmed. And you think about their experience up to this point in 325, and you can certainly understand it, because it really wasn't even that long ago that they were being formally persecuted by the Roman authorities, and in particular at the directive of a Roman emperor, as we know, who is Diocletian. So they're a bit, overwhelmed, but it does seem to be accepted in a rather positive manner, despite the fact this is a total whiplash for them, if you think about it.
Yeah,
and it's just the fact that you have a Roman Empire emperor who has, one, embraced Christianity, goodness gracious, and now is actually actively involving himself in church affairs. I don't think many of them found themselves in a position to complain, especially when you hear stories about those who did attend and apparently being able to see various injuries that they incurred at the time of these formal persecutions that now, oh my goodness, we have official sanction.
It is. And in the same way I just said how long it took Christianity to form into what it is, conversely, how quickly Rome went from disliking Christianity to being Christian itself. Like I said, it was less than 100 years ago, less than 50 years ago or so, that people were being punished and persecuted for being Christian. As you just mentioned, it's just crazy when you put it into perspective like that. It just takes one person to have a different opinion, and suddenly the entire empire has changed. And that's just wild.
It absolutely is. So we're looking at a period of just a little over 20 years from the formal first edict given by Diocletian in 303 to here we are today in the summer of, 325? 325, discussing this with official sanction, where the emperor is actually having a very particular role in all of this. It's incredible for them. So they're handling this on a pretty positive manner. They're definitely not going to start biting the hand that feeds them at this point. They're not fools. But the question now is, so what is the main point of strife? How did we ever get here? And largely, as this thing goes, this really boils down to a fellow by the name of Arius, who was from Cyrenaica, which today is basically modern northwest Egypt, for the most part, maybe Libya. I'm not 100% sure, but right up there on the northern Mediterranean coast. And he was a priest, and he was a priest that was teaching that Jesus of Nazareth, was a being that was separate from God. Very important. There's no underlying, there's no denying the importance that Jesus has in this case, but Jesus is not God itself. And for Arius, this was a point of major revelation to him, though this was in direct contrast to the general understanding and mostly organic consensus by many Christian leaders at the time that Jesus was so-called co-eternal with God. That means when he died, he goes back into this non-corporeal existence. He was God made flesh, and he existed from the beginning as God did as well. So you can definitely understand where this point of contention surely exists and why it's as big of a deal as it is.
And this is an issue that still seems to be a thing to this day. I've asked Christian friends, because I've never quite known this myself, for God and Jesus meant to be one and the same. And every time I've asked Christian friends, it's never been a clear-cut yes or no answer. So by and large, Paul, do you know what Christians of today believe on this matter?
It varies just as much as it did in the early 4th century, let's put it that way. There are many different takes on this, from the concept of Jesus being wholly divine, co-equal to God, going back into eternity from the beginning of existence, to somebody that was born human and died human, but during that time came to a greater revelation. Those are, that's how far the spectrum goes. In many of these cases, especially when you're talking about Christianity that has so many different denominations and so many different followings within those denominations, it's very difficult to agree square on anything. So the reason you're getting so many different answers is because in many ways for a lot of people, and certainly throughout Christianity in its various iterations, there is no one answer.
And it's interesting because so often in Christianity, whenever you have a problem, you go to the Bible for the answer. So that makes me wonder, is there any writings in the Bible that confirm this at all? Did Jesus ever flat out call himself God in the Bible or the New Testament or anything?
This is tricky. This is super tricky. So as we know, we have the 4 Gospels that eventually became canon. We're going to discuss this particular issue more at the end because there's a lot of confusion over this regarding Nicaea, but let's just look at this one particular point, which is that in the New Testament, it seems in the Gospel of John, which from all we can tell was the last one to be written relative to the other 3 that became canon, that there are definitely certain inference that he is divine, but also that's something that is very much in line with how that particular gospel, in this case being John, generally operates. John is very different than the other 3. We've talked about this quite tangentially in the episodes prior where we're talking about the New Testament and Jesus and all of that. It's much more supernatural in nature, very much different than the other 3. So there definitely does seem to be some allusion to that in John. And of the other 3, of which they kind of separate the Mark, Matthew, and Luke from John, just given the incredibly different nature of those writings. In Mark, there is something basically like the divinity secret, where throughout it, when you're reading it, there is this ongoing idea that Jesus is withholding the knowledge that he's actually divine. So this is a very difficult answer to try to get directly from the 4 Gospels in the New Testament themselves. So, be that as it may. But getting back to Arius. Arius fell afoul of somebody that ultimately caused this greater council to end up being convened in the first place, and that is St. Alexander of Alexandria. Quite easy to remember, I think. He was a bishop, and obviously, like I said, St. Alexander, so he became a saint. And St. Alexander of Alexandria was totally the other way than Arius. He believed that Jesus was co-eternal with God, so you have these 2 very differing pieces here in terms of, well, how do we understand the Christological nature of Jesus himself? And this thing lasted 3 months. It took 3 months
to hash out.
And you can only imagine what it must have been like going through that process in those walls over 3 months in the middle of summer in modern-day Turkey. That is a feat, just thinking of it on a practical level, if I've ever heard one.
It sounds like the film 12 Angry Men to an extent, just this hot and bothered room with lots of people arguing in it.
Anybody who's sat through long committee meetings in less than pleasant circumstances is most certainly going to have a sympathy and empathy for what this was like enduring it, that it probably was. And you have to imagine some very strong words and very strong opinions were being thrown around the entire time. And so what did this 3 months in Nicaea really achieve? Well, at the end of the day, the council ended up very much siding with Alexander of Alexandria and his conception of Jesus, mostly having to do with the fact that they felt for the most part it conformed best with the scriptures that they were using and just the general understanding of Christianity and Jesus at the time. And what came of it, interestingly enough, is something known as the Nicene Creed. Now, their version of the Nicene Creed, and the Nicene Creed that so many Christians have undoubtedly either heard or repeated themselves in, whatever, in case of like Mass or any sort of service that they've been to, these things are a bit different. And when I read out their Nicene Creed, you'll probably see some of the differences between the two. So their Nicene Creed went as such: we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten of the Father, the only begotten, that is, in the essence of the Father, God of God, light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance, also known as homouousian, with the Father, by whom all things were made, both in heaven and on earth. For us men and our salvation came down and was incarnate and was made man. He suffered, and the third day he rose again, ascended into heaven. From thence he shall come to judge the quick and the dead, and in the Holy Ghost. There was a time when he was not, and he was not before he was made, and he was made out of nothing, or he is made of another substance or essence, or the Son of God is created, or changeable or alterable, they condemn by the Holy Catholic and Despotic Church. So basically, and some of that were some academic little bars there to help us better understand as the reader the exact context of what they were saying, but that's generally what it came to.
That's like a lot to take in there, like so many.
Definitely. And that's a very limited, think about it, that's a very limited conclusion based on where they could have gone.
And like some of it sounds almost contradictory, like he was not before he was made. That's kind of hard. And like he was made out of nothing. It's like, it's hard to get your head around what exactly that's supposed to mean.
Yeah.
But something I'm interested in, do we have any records of this council, the Council of Nicaea? Does anything still exist to this day to prove that it actually even happened?
Well, we know that it happened.
Okay. Yeah.
We know that it happened. The question is, what were the various arguments and the debates that happened while it was in session? And while there's very good reason to believe that there was somebody there taking minutes as they would, because they're coming out of a Roman tradition in terms of bookkeeping for the most part. They know how to run a council. They know how to make sure that they get the agenda taken down and write in shorthand who did what. They were capable of this quite so. And you have to imagine it existed, but unfortunately, we have not found any copies or records of it. The biggest thing that came out of it in this case was that Nicene Creed above. And what I can tell you this is, though, when we start getting into the Son of God is created or changeable or alterable, those are all, in that case, academic notes that help suss out exactly the context of it for scholars that have studied this in great detail. Largely, for the most part, it ends with the words, and in the Holy Ghost, for the most part, for their purposes. Though, like I said, the Nicene Creed has changed. That is not a version of it that most people today will be familiar with. But in terms of like taking minutes and things of that nature, you have to imagine they took them. We just haven't found them.
Gosh, that'd be a good find. That sounds like a job for Nicolas Cage or something.
Watch your tongue.
So, speaking of Nicolas Cage, what happened to Arius, the guy who kind of still got the ball rolling on all of this? What happened to him, the Egyptian dude?
He was exiled.
The Egyptian dude.
Yeah,
he was
exiled. Then. He was exiled, as you imagine. But it didn't stop him, and the controversy didn't end here. In truth, the controversy will never end. That's kind of the odd point of it all.
And something I find interesting about this is Arius. I think, am I pronouncing that right? Arius?
Arius, yes.
Arius, yes. He ended up being quite a pivotal role in Christianity, and that's what I find interesting. As I was mentioning back when we mentioned about that early form of the New Testament, there were these figures who really did move the religion forward, but aren't as well known to say. Like, would your average Christian know of Arius and the role he played in their religion?
So I believe there are Arian Christians out there.
Mm-hmm.
If not directly, and noting him by name, are certainly operating very much on the basis in which he taught. I've seen this firsthand. It's one of those things where you believe what you believe, I suppose, but he definitely had an ongoing legacy, and this did not stop him, even though he was exiled. And he did keep teaching. And interestingly enough, over time, even Constantine himself became more tolerant and kind of open to this idea that Arius was teaching, but he would end up dying in 336, and it's often suspected, I should add, that he did so due to poisoning from those who opposed him. You might have been able to kill Arius, but you couldn't kill the idea.
I guess something I find interesting, Paul, that just came to mind, is in regards to Rome's previous religion, the Roman mythology, aka Greek mythology, is those stories were interpreted in many different ways. I'm sure even in the time of Rome itself, there were multiple different stories of Heracles and Zeus and all that sort of thing going on. So this was a group of people who had learnt to follow one religion but different interpretations of the same religion. But they just couldn't do that with Christianity. They had to be like, this is the way Christianity was. Arius, no, your way's wrong. And as you said, there are Arius followers of the more Arius style of Christianity to this day, potentially. It's just interesting. At the time, they weren't quite that. They thought Christianity had to be this one specific thing and work in this one specific way, where they'd already come from a religion that had kind of interpreted the same stories in different ways anyway.
That's actually a really good point to mention here. They certainly seem to have, whether knowingly or unknowingly, imbibed some of these greater traditions in terms of these stories when it comes to, in this case, say, the Greco-Roman gods, whether Roman paganism or the Hellenistic religion of the Greeks. So, yeah, that's actually a really fine point. But what's interesting here, and I think this is the thing that's kind of like the 500-pound gorilla in the room, is, of course, Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code.
Yes, and you mentioned the Da Vinci Code earlier. And is there actually any evidence that the canon of the Bible was discussed or determined there, or that Constantine even had any hand in their choosing?
Not that I'm aware of. If there is documentation that actually came up, it's new to me, and it's something that most scholars generally are not that keen on, to be sure. There just isn't enough evidence there to say one way or the other. For the most part, most major scholars of Christianity, when it comes to the actual formation of the New Testament and the books that ultimately become the canon that we know today, happen over a much longer period of time in a much more organic process, almost like they were choosing themselves in a way over time. So as far as I can tell, and the research that I've done, this is something that is often very much opposed to this idea of anything having to do with what's going on regarding the books of the New Testament being discussed here, determined here, or Constantine having any role in that. So unfortunately, for the most part, Nicaea is important because of the whole debate regarding the divinity of Jesus and is Jesus God, is Jesus co-eternal with God, or is he something separate from God? From what I know and what I have read and what I have heard, matters regarding what's going into the New Testament and who's choosing it and it being chosen here or Constantine having any role in it whatsoever does not seem to be the case.
So, do you want to know something quite controversial, Paul?
Well, lay it on me, Mr. Foote.
I have never watched nor read the Da Vinci Code.
I'd rather watch Gladiator first.
Well, this is what I'm thinking. We should definitely either do Gladiator or the Da Vinci Code for our next Steady History watches. I think it would be quite appropriate this time.
That's a spicy one. I like those ideas. I like those ideas.
But I've heard a mix of things. I've heard it's a very easy sort of read and watch, very interesting. But like I mentioned Nicolas Cage earlier, and that's of course in Ode to the National Treasure films, which are fantastic films. I have no one argue that, and they're also things we should watch at some point, Paul, because they're great films.
We have such a laundry list of films that we can do for AD History watches.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for sharing that information with us. This seems like a real massive step for Rome, this Council of Nicaea. Like I said, we're getting closer and closer to a Christian Rome, which in turn gives us a Christian Europe, which in turn gives us modern Europe, more or less. And it's fascinating to see it all sort of starting here so far back in time.
It's true. And something to note here in terms of Constantine's role in Rome going more the Christian route. One is Rome was starting to largely go the Christian route organically before he even converted. That's one of the things we discussed a couple episodes back when you were asking about why Rome had such an issue with Christianity. And one of them is because it was an organic movement that was getting bigger and bigger over time. Two, with all the patronage and all of the things that were really beneficial to the church that Constantine did, he was not actually the emperor who officially made it the official religion. That comes a little bit later, and we'll tease that for a bit later. Mm-hmm. So these are things to think about, but this was the general idea behind Nicaea. It was a good swipe. Naturally, it did have some lasting impacts, But even to this day, in Christianity, throughout it in its many various iterations, there's still no agreement on what is the theological nature of Jesus. But this was a very important point, one, because now they're formally doing it out in the open with official sanction. And we're beginning to see how Constantine, through his involvement in various elements of Christianity and the church, unintentionally in a way, begins to mold it as well. So this was definitely something I wanted to do and get into a little bit, just so we could get our ABCs on this one straight. But after this, we're going to get into our Patreon submitted question, which is going to be a real banger. I'll tell you that. I'm looking forward to this one. So us here, you there, and we'll be back right after a word from Anna Domini.
This is the AD History Podcast.
And thank you, Anna. So, Paul, we are back with our famous middle segment where one of our amazing patrons submit a question for us. And this week's question is an interesting one. It's one I haven't really got a defined answer for. So I'm looking to chat to you about it, Paul. And the question is, if you were to encounter a time traveler from one of our countries traveling to the present from 1980, how would you explain and indoctrinate them to our present day? So, Paul, I'm going to throw this one to you. 1980s USA to modern day USA. How would you go about explaining what's changed in those 40-odd years? Gosh, it's been 40 years now. In my head, the 80s was only 20 years ago, but no, 40 years ago now.
That's a basket full. And I got to say, it's a really good Patreon submitted question. And if you want to submit a Patreon submitted question that we answer in the middle segment of our show, donate at the $5 tier or higher. Send the message to us, put in the question, and we'll end up answering it. So we thank our patron for submitting this question today. Now, getting down to the actual answer, I think the first thing that came to mind is, well, I have some good news and I have some bad news. The good news is that the Cold War is over with the Soviet Union. The bad news is we're in a new Cold War with China. Just getting that out of the way. Well, first off, it makes you appreciate just how much has changed in the little over 40 years that we're talking about. And I mean, in a huge way. A huge way has things changed. And so the first question is, I mean, where do you even start with something like that? And, you know, first things first, I think it would take a good deal of time. I mean, in fact, if this was the only person who ever did it, whoever traveled to our time from that particular year or earlier, you would probably want to sit down and figure out a whole mess of things that you would want them to know about and try to get them up to speed on. I suppose the first thing that I would choose to do, and I think this is kind of a natural idea just given how much it's revolutionized our society, is we would have to begin explaining the internet.
Yeah. It was starting to be a thing. Probably not to the average person.
Definitely not. But to the military, it was becoming a thing.
But I feel like if you're time traveling, you've probably got if you're time traveling in the 80s, you probably have some sort of understanding of the internet anyway. Because
maybe, but not likely. not from 1980 itself.
Yeah, I guess
most people don't even have a personal computer.
Yeah, but yeah, definitely explain the internet would be very, very pivotal. But how would you do that? What would you compare the internet to? So it's like a magazine, it's like a newspaper, but on a screen. Like, how would you explain it?
That's the thing, is because even if they did have some like very mild conception of what the internet might be, it would in no way comport with how we understand the internet and its incarnation as it exists today. Because you figure the internet became a thing really to the public where we could access it in a meaningful way in the mid-90s. So we're literally talking about a decade and a half beyond when they took off.
And by internet, you mean the World Wide Web itself.
Correct.
Like the actual, yeah.
Being able to sit down, open a browser, put in an address, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you also can't take for granted how our understanding of the internet has evolved and things that we take for granted. Here's a great example. Take text messaging. Text messaging doesn't mean the same thing if you didn't live through things like AOL Instant Messenger or Trillion, things of that nature, where in many cases text messaging is in some ways an outgrowth of even that. And that's really, in that case, you're almost talking about Internet 1.0. Or things like email, for example. or the nature of how we communicate in general, and just this instantaneous ability that we now possess, not even in need of a personal computer on a desktop, to be able to access this thing largely unhindered despite the device that we're using.
At least one Star Wars film. My Star Wars timeline isn't perfect. Surely at least one had come out by 1980.
Well, the first one came out in 77.
77. So was the second one 81?
80 is when we get Empire, and 83 is
80.
Jedi.
Okay, but that must have some form of instant messaging on it. Like, well, let's just hope they've seen Star Wars. And can we try and explain? Like, I'm trying to find a point of reference to explain to someone. It's kind of like that thing you've seen. Like, I'm trying to think of things that have been made by 1980 that depicted something vaguely like the internet. Star Wars is coming to mind.
I mean, in a way it does, but not really so much in the original trilogy.
No, I guess not.
You might have seen it in the prequels, but if you're a Star Wars fan that's traveling from 1980 and you're leaving at a point before Empire has been dropped, well, I have good news for you, man. You're going to catch up real fast on how the initial saga ends, and God only knows what your opinions are going to be on the prequels, to say nothing of the dreaded sequels. But there's a lot to catch up on there, but the internet is really, at least I think, probably the one thing where you kind of have to start just because of how it affects literally everyday life.
And also, once you teach them how to use the internet, they can learn for themselves, because they could catch up pretty quickly on what happened in the 40 intermittent years and the 40 between years just by understanding how to use Wikipedia.
That's true, but in terms of communicating a more human understanding of those who actually went through it, I think it's something that would probably be my greater emphasis. So, despite the quip I made at the beginning of the Cold War, naturally that's something they're going to want to know about, which is in 1980, there was no reason to believe that the Soviet Union would end up collapsing 11 years later.
No, you're very much in the depths of the Cold War by 1980 still. Yeah, things didn't seem to be ending anytime soon.
Most certainly not. And on top of that, what happened to the world when it went away? How did this change the nature of our two countries, which in a very serious way it did, because we were both in the West. We were both countries that were targeted, in terms of mutually assured destruction. Those were things that hung over the head of both our countries throughout that time. And on top of that, then, if you're trying to give them a general bullet point catch up, then you have to explain everything that happened regarding 9/11.
Yeah.
Which obviously is its own basket, to be sure.
I'm trying to think where the UK was. So was Thatcher in power by 80 or she 81?
I thought she came into power in around 79.
70. I know it was like on the cusp of the 80s. So yeah, if you're coming from Britain from the 1980s, you're probably just seen the early days of Thatcher's administration. I would let our time-traveling friend know that while Thatcher isn't gone, her legacy very much remains. And that can be seen with the likes of our current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. But just the world we're living in, it was Thatcher who closed the mines. She sold off a lot of council housing. And it's those sorts of things that are still having ramifications. To this day, she privatized a lot of other things. We are fundamentally still living in Thatcher's Britain. And that's something I'll have to let them know. So in some ways, not much has changed in the grand scheme, but how I would explain and indoctrinate them in our present day, I think you're right, Paul. The internet is a great way to go because it is so fundamental to our present day. I'm trying to think if there's any specific TV shows I'd make them watch to understand how to understand what today is like, or what books I'd make them read, or what news sources I'd make them watch to understand how
really
things are going as well.
Really good points.
I'm just trying to think. Nothing's coming to mind. We've got Bake Off, of course, which is very homely and British. Maybe get them to sit and watch some Great British Bake Off, that sort of thing. But I don't know off the top of my head. I think the internet is a great way to go. And just as I said, trying to make them understand how to use the internet, whether that be on a smartphone, even explain to them what a smartphone is. I mean, they'll probably have a concept of a computer, because I think big beige computer boxes must have existed by 1980.
Oh, most definitely.
And we're in the public conscious. No, yeah, but they're in the public conscious. So you can kind of understand, like the iMac I'm looking at right now, you can kind of understand how the big beige box of the 80s became an iMac of today. But understanding a smartphone must be mind-boggling. Like, that's, yeah.
Let's take the smartphone that's currently in my hand. It's one of the newer editions of the iPhone. Obviously, we're recording this in the first week of November of 2021. If I handed this device with full operability, where it has all the capabilities that can be used as designed, to myself in the summer of 2005, my mind would be blown away. And you hand the same device to this hypothetical 1980 time traveler, and it would be more than I think many of us could take in at just one go, given all that it can do and how much, on an exponential basis, how much more powerful it is to the computers of their day.
And even telling them that it's not only the really fancy people who have one of these, everyone has one.
Yeah, it's something that is absolutely commonplace, and our experience as human beings on the day-to-day have been wholly integrated with it. That's the thing that's interesting to understand there.
It's just everywhere you go, you'll find the internet, you'll find smartphones, you'll find Wi-Fi and technology. And that would be the fundamental thing to teach them. However, something I'm wondering, Paul, if they were like, I don't like this, I want to go somewhere like the 1980s, where would you take them? Where hasn't changed in the USA since the 1980s you could take them?
Well, I mean, if you're just walking down the street on the everyday, if you're, just say strolling through Lower Manhattan or something like that, I don't think that anything would necessarily appear that alien to them. There may be some subway routes that exist now that didn't exist then, or things of that nature, but you would start getting bogged down in the details of how we pay for things, or how various, transactions occur that would be entirely alien to them.
And they might even be asking, why is everyone wearing face masks?
Well, that's the other thing we have to very much explain in terms of what's going on there, and that would be its own whole thing, to be sure.
Yeah.
But you start with the internet, because I don't think you can start anywhere else. You try to give them as best as possible a grasp on the political realities that have occurred since they took off up into the present day, and the landscape that exists there. The funny thing about this question is I think it says as much about the person answering it as it does about the answers themselves and how it would affect our hypothetical time traveler.
It kind of explained, it shows what me and you, it shows what our priorities are, more or less. The first thing we both went to say is to make a dig about the political climate of both times.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. And, we talk about the internet. The internet is entirely central to how you and I make a living.
Exactly, yeah. Like, especially to me and you, like, say if they were to meet our parents, if they were to meet, would our parents be as inclined to say, hey, like, check the internet, because maybe it's not as ubiquitous in their life. And our parents probably came from the 1980s, Paul. They were there.
Yeah.
So maybe that would be interesting as well.
This person, in all likelihood, would be our parents' age today. And then, you get into other bigger things. If we're talking the politics side, we're talking about the rise of China, which had only been in its most nascent state in 1980 with the reforms and opening up under Deng Xiaoping, or the nature of economic reality today, the ability to work from home, how entertainment has changed, how we relate to each other, just a whole bunch of things that we couldn't even begin to get into in just like one solid introductory session. You would have to handhold them for quite a long time, because you figure there's probably also a ton of various mores and faux pas that did not exist in 1980 that exist today, and I can't even begin to think of them all. They wouldn't be totally alien because they'd still be human. They would still be generally of a modern era. They'd have the ability to adapt, but it would take time, a lot of time and exposure, and a lot of work.
Who's going to break the news about blockbusters to them, Paul?
I mean, did Blockbuster even exist in 1980 in the way we understood it?
I don't know. I just presumed
they
it
had
would
video
have done.
rental stores, I think, but
yeah, they must have done.
That's another key example. Or you look at things like video games. My goodness, how much those have changed in that time. Think about that for a moment.
Mario was 2 years. Mario was still 2 years away, to put it into perspective. 1982.
Yeah,
I believe 83. 85. I think 85 can go. That's my final answer, Paul. 85.
Yes, of course. And you have won the $1 million question. Yeah, these are all these little bits and pieces of cultural insight that this person just wouldn't have. And so it's incredibly difficult. And here's an interesting kind of sub-question to this. How far back could we realistically go in terms of a time travel origination point where they would still have the ability to genuinely adapt?
I think anything post-war. Off the top of my head, I think maybe even post-First World War?
Maybe. I mean, they had radio then, obviously, so that wouldn't be unusual. They didn't have TV yet, really.
No, maybe maybe post-Second World War, which in the grand scheme isn't that far back, but that's how far I would go, I would say. Maybe post-World War II. So
1945, you couldn't really do it before that.
Yeah.
Maybe 1950 even, that's kind of a good, mentally satisfying point of demarcation that before that, it probably wouldn't go so well. I mean, it's hard to tell by the individual, of course, but on the whole, I would say you couldn't really go earlier than the end of the Second World War.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm leaning towards as well, because just the world changed so much. No, like everyone had lived through so much. The people who were alive prior to the Second World War and people who were alive prior, it's just different people.
Undeniably so, and a lot of which having to do with the circumstances, all of which are almost essentially out of their control, of which they live. But even think about like the interpersonal connections and the various, references and quips that we make due to a common cultural understanding from any number of, say, media franchises or products that we just kind of give to each other offhand that we almost intuitively understand that they wouldn't get whatsoever. It's almost like we'd be speaking a second language. They could catch up, but it would take a lot of time.
Funnily enough, superheroes have kind of come full circle, Paul.
Haven't they?
Yeah, I guess Batman was 81. The Superman films would have been out by then. Marvel were big in the 60s, as were DC, of course. And superheroes are still about, but like instead of reading comic books, you watch them on the screen. So like some things have kind of come full circle. And the 80s is also kind of in vogue at the moment. And of course, by 1980 itself, what we consider 80s culture probably wasn't a thing yet. Like even if you showed them Stranger Things, that would seem alien, if you pardon the pun.
Yeah, I mean they would actually really more or less be a child of the 1970s than really anything to do with the 80s. I mean they'd just be coming out of disco.
Yeah, so maybe show them some sort of disco stuff, some stuff from the 70s to help, some stuff retroactively made today that is set in the 70s, that sort of thing, to help them understand how their era is perceived to the modern eye.
Absolutely, and you kind of have to just gently indoctrinate them in, because if you were to just throw them into the deep end of the pool, that would be almost cruel.
Yeah, like it would have to be baby steps just to understand this is different like this now, this is different now. Coke tastes. Oh no, they wouldn't have been alive in New Coke.
They didn't even experience New Coke yet.
Coke still tastes the same as you remember it tasting. It's fine. They had a bit of a bump a bit later on, but that's fine. But just show them things that did exist in their time, but also introduce things that are new, like get them a Coke but pay with a contactless payment way or that sort of thing. Just say, hey, look, this is still the same. We do it a little bit differently, but it's still fundamentally the same thing.
Absolutely. So there's no great answer to this question. And we were doing this quite intentionally off the cuff just to kind of give us an organic response of how we would face this if it kind of just dropped into our lap. But there are so many elements that undoubtedly you aren't thinking of. And if you're listening to this episode, especially if you're listening on YouTube, leave a comment down below for how you would choose to indoctrinate somebody that's coming here for the first time since 1980, whether it be stuff that we've mentioned or the great many things undoubtedly we never even thought about.
Yeah, please do tell us down below. We, as much as we enjoy answering these questions, we enjoy hearing your answer to these questions just as much, because they're always very insightful and interesting.
Oh, they're amazing. They're absolutely amazing. So we'd like to thank our patron for submitting this question. This was definitely one of the more challenging ones, to be sure. And if you want to support AD History and help us make the AD history you deserve, you can do so by going over to Patreon at patreon.com/ADHistoryPodcast. Once again, that's patreon.com/ADHistoryPodcast. And you can donate to us on a monthly basis beginning at $3 a month or higher, which include getting the new episodes 48 hours early, in addition to its director's cut, where it's a bit more of an in-studio feel, and there are parts of the episode that we include in that don't make the greater public cut. Doesn't take anything away from the public cut, but it adds some stuff to it that I think you guys will enjoy. Of course, the $5 tier regarding being able to submit a Patreon submitted question. Or if you're on YouTube, we now also have a one-time donation through PayPal towards AD History, because we know somebody can't always donate on a month-to-month basis, but they want to help out the show. And that's most certainly available there in the space down below. But we'd like to thank you guys so much for helping support us. It's helping us do a lot of amazing things that you are going to benefit from very soon. Let's put it that way. And once again, thank you. We want to hear your thoughts on this question as well. But us here, you there, and we'll be back right after a word from Anna Domini.
This is the AD History Podcast. Keep up with the show and join the discussion by following AD History on Twitter with the handle @ADHistoryPC and the hashtag ADHistory. Check us out over on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching AD History Podcast, as well as, of course, tgnreview.com/ADHistoryPodcast. Also, check out the AD History Podcast on Patreon. See how you can help support the show and the rewards that await you by exploring the AD History Podcast on Patreon. See the link in the description. Now, back to Paul and Patrick.
And thank you, Anna. And that little musical bit there that we used during the mid-roll is actually kind of interesting. It was given to us through a fan of the channel. The person who did that keyboard bit there, Patrick, you'll find very interesting. His name is Adam Eppolito. He actually played and toured with John Lennon.
Huh, very impressive.
Isn't that cool? And he's also did the keyboard bit on Kool and the Gang's very famous song, Celebration. Celebrate good times. Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah, so, we apparently the show has a slightly larger reach than we thought. So that was a really cool thing to have there at the mid-roll, and we really like to thank National Nervous Breakdown for sending us in another bit there that we could use in our mid-roll.
It's really
Patrick,
cool stuff. Thank you very much.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. It's so cool. You never realize the people that you reach sometimes, But in any case, the topic you're about to get into is really great because we addressed it in our most recent 3rd century, What We Missed. We kind of caught up on it, but a lot of it was actually teasing for the big enchilada that was going to come here in the 4th century. And you're getting to hear to that today. And of course, that is the true founding of the Gupta Empire itself. And with that, Mr. Foote, you have the floor.
Thank you, Paul. So, yeah, this is a really big moment in Indian history, and it's because this was the start of the Gupta Empire. Well, kind of. Though we mentioned in previous episodes that the seeds of the Gupta Empire were planted way earlier, and that was actually back in the last century. So why are we talking about it now? The Gupta Empire started in the last century. Why am I also saying here the Gupta Empire started? Well, it's because it was in this decade that the Gupta Empire found its first truly great leader, and that was in the shape of Chandragupta. And it was he who expanded the Gupta Empire from being just one of India's many small provincial powers on the subcontinent into the huge empire it became that took up so much of what we would now call India. And it was in this decade where that expanded started to take shape. However, I want to go back further. I think it's great to sort of lay the groundwork and to understand, because we haven't really dedicated that much time to India. We've dropped in and out of it, but to truly understand that this is our first proper introduction to what was going on the subcontinent as we now know it at this time. It's worth knowing what's happening before this time as well. And as I mentioned, the Gupta Empire at its peak looks like it took up much of modern India. But this was not the first empire to do so. And before the Gupta Empire, we had the Maurya Empire. And this huge Maurya Empire covered much of modern India and the surrounding nations. And this Maurya Empire lasted from 322 BC to 184 BC. And it was founded by one Chandragupta Maurya.
So, based on the fact that this greater Gupta Empire at this point is really going to expand, and the fact that its leader is going to become known as Chandragupta as well. I'm assuming there's no coincidence there.
From what I could tell, this second Chandragupta are the Gupta Empire's Chandragupta.
Yeah.
He seems to have just had that name. Maybe he was named in honor of the Chandragupta Maurya of this empire. Not 100% sure. It could have just been a coincidence, but I imagine perhaps this guy was named in honor of this previous empire in hopes that he would become another great emperor.
Okay. All right. Well, that makes sense.
Yeah, and going back to this Maurya, Chandragupta Maurya, he is seen as something of a national hero in India, and he's seen as being the first person to unify all of India. And he's also seen as saving the nation from sort of poor administration and foreign rule. Without him, he was one that allowed India to be a fuller, stronger power to defend itself from foreign attackers. And as I mentioned, his empire came to an end in 184 BC. And there isn't one fact as to why it collapsed. It just slowly dissolved, as these things often do. And its dissolution is seen as starting way earlier than 184 BC. Maurya's third emperor, Ashoka, he ruled from 268 BC to 232 BC.
I find it interesting. That name is awfully close to one of the more popular modern Star Wars characters who's become quite beloved. So, by the name of Ahsoka. So,
yeah,
a little getting touching close there. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but who knows when it comes to George Lucas, considering that character's inception still happened under the oversight of George Lucas.
Yeah, I am. When I was researching this episode, I was like, gosh, that's incredibly similar to Ahsoka's name. In fact, I thought it was the same, but it's not. There's a slight spelling difference. No.
A little difference there.
I was wondering if there's any link between the two. I'm not sure. This Ashoka is a man. Ahsoka from Star Wars is female. I'm not sure. Who knows?
It's hard to know. With George Lucas, he was obviously always so famous for blending East and West. Sometimes it's almost impossible to tell. But I do believe Ahsoka was actually Dave Filoni's character, the one he came up with, but he is George Lucas's number one acolyte, so who can say?
No, who can say? And in regards to Star Wars names, that's something I need to cover at some point. There's some bizarre names in that universe. So anyway, Star Wars chat aside, Ashoka, this Emperor Ashoka, he ruled from 268 to 232 BC, and he is seen as being the Maurya Empire's last great leader, only 3, and they were gone. And after his death, things started to fall apart, and the empire and another empire didn't actually immediately take over the Maurya Empire. Instead, India kind of became what it was before the Maurya Empire. It became a series of smaller states and kingdoms and provinces, like it was for so much time. And by the time the Mauryan Empire ended in 184 BC, it was just another one of those smaller states. And I think you might wonder, Patrick, why have you mentioned this? And I just think it's worth mentioning this deeper history to India because, Paul, a lot of people often like to depict India as just being a series of independent kingdoms and empires, and then the British put it all together and made more or less the modern Indian borders as we have it today. But India, much like China, you could argue, it's gone through a history of being one united entity to being separate states to one united entity and there and back again. I just think that's worth mentioning here. We see that not only with this Gupta Empire, but also the Maurya Empire as well.
Well, certainly what we understand today as India is one thing that was undeniably, certainly in terms of its geographical shape, is undeniably and inextricably linked to the experience under the British Raj, and then prior to that under the East India Company, where, and this is something that I would actually like to really clarify, because it's something we kind of touched upon earlier in terms of the British kind of helping create this nationalist Indian identity, which was something relatively new at that time. The way that the Raj largely worked, and even with the East India Company, the way that the British really actually did a very effective being a value-neutral descriptor of running the Indian subcontinent in that time in that place, which of course was under the British Raj, you had many different states and principalities that were all being run by smaller rulers. And one of the ways that the British, of course, helped maintain control over it, that is by keeping them fighting with each other. But in terms of creating that national Indian identity, they also helped create a power that a lot of these states and a lot of these different people, because the Indian subcontinent is so diverse, it's silly. In the best
so
way.
Diverse.
Silly in the best way, because it brings so much to the table. And the British Raj, in many ways, in terms of this whole concept of Indian nationalism, gave a lot of these people a common adversary from which to unite. And even when they did achieve independence from Great Britain, obviously there was some definite changes. Obviously, Pakistan broke off. Burma, now Myanmar, became its own thing. And, of course, they also had very direct relationships with places like Nepal. We still have Gurkhas today. Nepalese still try to become Gurkhas in the British Army, to be sure. So it's interesting how this kind of works. But no, this whole concept of India, it is kind of this rising and falling of powers where it will, of course, shatter into many different places, then come together. It's very interesting that you should make that comparison with China, because I do think in some ways it's actually really quite apt.
And it's just what came to mind. Obviously, I've done a fair bit of research on China, and just doing this brought that to mind as well. But we're going to try and get a bit more in the ballpark of today's episode, and that's with the early formation of the Gupta Empire. So, as mentioned, this Maurya Empire truly dissolved in 184 BC, and this means by 1 AD, which was the start of this podcast, India was a series of smaller states yet again, and one of those many smaller states formed in 240 AD. So we're kind of getting closer, and that was, of course, the Gupta state. And, of course, Paul, that's why you mentioned it in our What We Missed of the 3rd Century, because the Gupta Empire did have its origins in the 2nd century, in about 240 AD. And
you bet your booty it does.
Exactly, and the exact origins of the Gupta people aren't exactly known to us, and they're thought to have either come from modern Uttar Pradesh or Bihar, and they're two modern states in India. It was definitely part of northern India, that's for sure. And to kind of have an idea, the Gupta Empire's capital of Pataliputra it was in the modern Bihar state. So you could lean towards saying the Gupta Empire has origins there. It's definitely northern India. We're not exactly sure. Probably one of those two states.
But it's in the ballpark.
It's in the ballpark for sure. And it was in 240 AD that the Gupta Empire was founded by one Sri Gupta. And of course, it's worth mentioning here that it didn't come into being as one massive empire. This was just another smaller empire on what we now call the Indian subcontinent. It didn't come out the gate as a massive thing. And its first leader was one Sri Gupta. And I think Sri means holy or blessed. It's the same Sri if it's the same Sri as we get in Sri Lanka, it means something along those lines. So it would be like Holy Gupta. Yeah,
we talked about Sri Gupta in the What We Missed, and unfortunately not a heck of a lot is known about him either, but he is a pivotal figure in all of this, because we're not even talking about this today without the actions that Sri Gupta took in order to basically put a foundation for this Gupta Empire that we are now discussing.
So yeah, Sri Gupta ruled the Gupta Empire from its inception in circa 240 AD till about 280 AD when he died. And he was, of course, as this was an empire, he was taken over, his son took over of Ghatotkacha. I think I'm pronouncing that right. He took over, and Ghatotkacha ruled from about 280 till 319. And in 319 AD, Chandragupta took over. This is the second Chandragupta. So finally, just shy of today's decade, our Chandragupta took over. So this makes our Chandragupta, became known as Chandragupta I. He was the grandson of the Gupta Empire's founder, Sri Gupta. So he wasn't that far descended from its roots. He was very much at the source of this thing. And other than that, we seem to know very little of his earlier life. And we aren't even truly sure if his reign started in 319 AD. That's just the day we like to go with. Most historians agree that his reign started in the first quarter of the 4th century. And whatever the case, when he took over, he took the Gupta Empire to the next level. He took it from just a small local state or kingdom to making it one of the largest empires in Indian history. And how exactly did he get so much of the subcontinent under his control? And normally this is where we start talking about military might and forcing this land using his powerful army. And while the military does play a role in all this, He actually started his larger empire in another way. His first expansion of the Gupta Empire came to be thanks to the skillful art of marriage. Yeah, this is some Game of Thrones stuff going on right now.
Diplomacy through matrimony.
Something we've seen quite often in AD history and other parts of the world, and we will see it more often. Another Indian, quote-unquote Indian kingdom at this time was the Chave Kingdom, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. This resided in the Kathmandu Valley, and it's actually in modern-day Nepal. So like I'm saying, that's a great example of the difference between India and the Indian subcontinent. An Indian kingdom can reside in modern-day Nepal. And the princess of this kingdom was one Princess Kamala Devi. And this marriage, so of Princess Kamala Devi and our man Chandragupta, got married. I don't know how they met. I don't have their cute meet or anything like that. That's not in the history books, unfortunately.
Certainly didn't meet on Tinder.
No, definitely not. But their marriage meant that Chave Kingdom fell under Chandragupta's rule. And we got to wonder, Paul, was this a marriage of convenience, or did you actually love each other?
Well, based on the strategic implications and benefits that occurred, it's at the very least, a marriage of convenience. But did you find anything that spoke to the nature of their relationship interpersonally as husband and wife?
Unfortunately, I did not. And I did have a good look around. I thought, is there anything? But nothing is really coming up, unfortunately. So it does sound like it was primarily a strategic marriage. But I'm sure they hopefully got on to some degree. We can only hope, right?
Well, I would imagine that would be a nice benefit, to be sure. But if we've learned anything about political marriages, at least in terms of the history of Europe, we've definitely learned that, one, it's very, very seldom, in many cases, that there's any sort of romantic attraction between the two individuals involved. And two, despite its intention as a political marriage, it doesn't always really pan out in the way that everybody hoped it would initially. But this seems to be an exception.
Yeah, so this one actually was quite prosperous because this marriage not only gave Chandragupta more land and a larger army, but also a very vital resource. The Chave Kingdom was rich in iron ore, and this benefited Chandragupta in a couple of ways. This iron, of course, allowed him to forge greater weapons and armor for his army, but also proved to be a highly valuable trading commodity. So this flooded the now larger Gupta Empire with weapons and wealth, and it made the Gupta army incredibly powerful, unsurprisingly. And this in turn allowed Chandragupta to easily claim many of India's other empires, just taking them down one by one, and it just grew his empire.
It's definitely a strategic windfall.
Yes, definitely. It's a marriage with benefits. Yeah.
Leave it at that. Leave it. Well put, my friend.
Yeah, but it's worth noting we aren't 100% sure that this is what happened. It's definitely the most popular theory on how the Gupta Empire started their rise. And unlike Rome, Indian history at this time has not been as well preserved. And we're always so fortunate to have such well-documented Roman history. As you said, Paul, they like taking their the minutes at their meetings.
So long as they survive, they are invaluable to students of history, historians, and you and I.
Yeah, and during his time as the Gupta Emperor, he grew his land immeasurably, and he even gave himself a new title. Maharaja Hilaja is what Chandragupta I became known as, and that meant King of Great Kings.
And yeah, that's definitely something that is awfully similar to the titles that are taken by the Shah of the Sassanid Empire, which go by, and we've heard this before in our last season, haven't we, Patrick? Shahan Shah, the King of Kings.
Yeah, it's a title that popped up throughout history in Rome's east, I will say, because where the Sassanid Empire were and where India are, quite distant, quite a bit of distance between the two of them. So it's impressive to hear this title cropping up, but it's just a name that clearly had resonance in the larger, towards the east of the Roman Empire.
Oh, you got that right. This does not seem to be any sort of coincidence as far as we can tell.
No, not at all, no. And Chandragupta I, his reign lasted from 319 till 335, so not that long, just a bit over each side of this episode's decade. And by the end of his reign, the Gupta Empire was in a far superior state than it had ever been. And his son, Samudragupta, he took over and he continued this trend. And he reigned actually from 335 till 375. So that's about 40 years or so. And he continued this expansion. And by about 250 AD, so this is going out the circle of our episode, the Gupta Empire covered most of India. It took up a huge expanse of the Indian subcontinent.
You know, it's interesting when you look at the later rule that's coming up of Samudragupta and how long it was. You're looking, that's 40 years. That's 40 years. Think about all the rulers that we have seen of these various empires, wherever they may be, have lasted. And 40 years puts you in very rarefied territory.
It really does. I mean, I'm kind of spoiled, Paul, because what's Lizzie on now? She's almost on 60 years? So 70 years?
So she was coronated, what, 52 or
52? So, yeah, so 70 years Elizabeth II's coming up to. So I'm kind of like, 40 years isn't that long, but that's just because of where I'm living, what time in history I'm living through, and what part of the world I'm living in. But no, make no mistake, 40 years reigning in India in antiquity is damn impressive.
Especially when you consider all the immense amount of threats that invariably come with ruling in that kind of autocratic fashion that you have to deal with throughout your entire rule. You know, the various enemies, the people that are trying to usurp you. And to put all of that off in one way or another to some degree for 40 years is outstanding. I mean, that puts you in Augustus territory in terms of longevity of rule.
Yeah, no, he's one of, and I'm sure we'll be covering his reign as we continue through AD history. But that's for another time. It was Chandragupta I, his father, that really got the ball moving on making the Gupta Empire a world-class empire. And the Gupta Empire's impact on modern India to this day, as you mentioned, Paul, in What We Missed, has been huge. Today in modern India, the Gupta Empire is seen as the nation's golden age. Many things of importance to India of Gupta origin, like as you mentioned, Paul, Gupta art and Gupta architecture is seen as one of India's finest. And the Gupta Empire made great contributions to maths and science. Do you want to know one of the really interesting things the Gupta Empire created, Paul? And this is something you kind of just presume would have existed. And it shows you just how impressive that they made something that is so integrated into our lives, into the world, something that's you'd think it would just exist the same way air or gravity does.
Now you're leaving me here with bated breath.
Okay, maybe I'm being a bit too over-exaggerated. They invented the decimal system.
No, I don't think that is something in which there can be any degree of unacceptable hyperbole. That is huge.
Imagine, you just think it would exist. You'd kind of think whoever invented numbers would invent the decimal system as well, but
apparently not so.
I don't have much more info on that. There's a really great article explaining all the things the Gupta Empire brought us, but that was the highlight of it to me, the decimal system. We've used, they're just a part of it. They're part of numbers. They're part of mathematics today.
When you think about the Middle East and when you think about its history as well as the history of the Indian subcontinent here, think about how much in general you amalgamate the two, how much they have contributed to our modern conception and expression of mathematics.
Yeah, that was just about, I was going to rattle on about that just now, Paul. But yeah, the modern numbers, at least me and you, Paul, most of the world uses the modern. They're of Indian origin, or at least of
the Arabic numerals.
Arabic numerals, that's the term. Yeah, they're of that origin, and that's amazing. Like, we give Rome a lot of credit for most things, but when it comes to numbers and maths, the Middle East, Arabia, and India, they played such a vital role, and it's worth highlighting again. Just the Gupta Empire's invention of the decimal system, the bloody decimal system, Paul. That's amazing. No
unacceptable level of hyperbole there in terms of its importance. I love that. That's where AD history is really firing.
Yeah, and it wasn't just maths they were good at. They did some pretty impressive Sanskrit poems as well. And this ancient golden period in Indian history that modern Indians look back on with pride, does it remind you of anything, Paul? If you think back to the very early days of AD history, does it remind you of anything at all?
Well, I think it's pretty fair to say that if you were to make one comparison, and I only had one, you have to consider how modern China, modern Han Chinese in particular, tend to view the Han Dynasty, both iterations of it.
Yeah, and that's what came to mind for me. Like, I remember when I was first studying, when we first began AD history, I was looking at the Han Dynasty, and it really was seen as that golden age of Chinese history, and so many celebrated Chinese creations came from the Han Dynasty, and that's that kind of pride, how Han Chinese people hold it to the Han Dynasty, seems to be the same sort of pride modern Indians hold in the Gupta Empire.
And with good reason.
Decimals, Paul. Decimals.
But on top of that, you think about if you and I were to stop, we'll take the Taj Mahal out of this because we're not quite there yet. But if you think about a variety of different architectural structures that are really just burned into our mind's eye when we think about the Indian subcontinent or even just India itself today, so much of that is coming from this Gupta period. And that is undeniable. And it truly, from everything I can tell, even in the brief overview I did in What We Missed, it was abundantly clear that this was a very special time.
Mm-hmm. However, I don't think we've probably even talked about the biggest impact the Gupta Empire made to India and the Indian subcontinent. And it kind of parallels what was happening in Rome at this time. In the same way Christianity was spreading through Rome in this decade and this century, Hinduism was spreading through the Indian subcontinent, Paul. And it was actually the Gupta Empire who began this mass spread of Hinduism across India, because the Gupta Empire was a Hindu empire. Yeah.
And we even kind of spoke about this a little bit in What We Missed regarding Sri Gupta. Is in his case, even though Hinduism has definitely become ingrained, in the case of Sri Gupta, at least, he also most certainly did patronage for not just Hinduism, but Buddhism and Jainism as well. So there's a lot going on here, but it definitely appears like this is a time where Hinduism is really taking hold, and the Guptas seem to be quite okay with that.
Yeah, so as the Gupta Empire spread across the subcontinent, as did the Hindu religion too. And of course, to this day, Hinduism is India's dominant religion. You know, it's the official de facto religion. Of course, there are many other religions across India. Christianity's popular, of course, Islam, Buddhism. They can all be found in India and the Indian subcontinent.
And when you look at Hinduism, especially when you compare it to the religions you just did, its origins are almost unfathomably old.
Yeah, like, even though I'm saying this is where it got popular, I believe it's the oldest big religion. I'm sure there's some ancient, tiny religions we don't really know of that still have roots in parts of the world. But in regards to large-scale religions that are still on this planet, Hinduism, I believe, is the eldest of them by a long shot.
I think you're correct. I think you are correct on that point.
So it's understandable why modern India looks so fondly back on this golden age of the Gupta Empire, and it all kicked off right here in this decade. And it was thanks to Emperor Chandragupta I, and of course his choice in women.
Yes, of course.
And as I mentioned, this is the empire's start. This is only at the beginning, and we are definitely going to be talking about the Gupta Empire in upcoming episodes, Paul. And I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to having another big player on the world stage.
Here's an interesting question that we can leave up, especially, considering the theme of a golden age in which people look back on. On some level, one, are we experiencing one right now in the West in particular, in a grander kind of scheme of things? And two, in experiencing it, would we necessarily be able to readily identify it?
You know what, Paul? Just as you were saying that, I was about to pose a question to you, and that was, do you think America's had its golden age yet? But that's a very, like you said, it's a very good question as well. Are we aware we're in a golden age. I don't think we are, unless things are going really well. I think golden ages are made, like we say, like most memories you're going to look back on fondly. It's nostalgia. It's basically nostalgia times 10 when we look back and think of a golden age. You don't realize how good things were until they're over with. So I imagine the Gupta Empire probably didn't know they were in a golden age, but now we can look back at it. But as I was sort of thinking to you, Paul, do you think America has had its golden age yet?
This is very difficult to answer because when you're knee deep in it, it's very difficult to gain any sort of meaningful perspective. I would say it's easier to identify when a historically significant moment is occurring contemporaneously in the moment than it is to necessarily come to any sort of accurate conclusion of whether your time in which you exist and where you exist is undergoing a golden age. And I say that because when you look back at history and you look at contemporaneous accounts of how people felt at the time they were living, almost exclusively you'll feel, especially in more modern history terms, they'll always generally think, oh, this is the hardest and worst of times. But in reality, especially in the more modern history context, there is this reoccurring theme of, we are living through the most difficult time with the greatest challenges. And sometimes it takes decades to realize, well, they may have thought that at the time, but now with greater distance and hopefully a bit more objectivity, that is something that we can more better determine. So I couldn't possibly answer that with any form of accuracy or certainty, unfortunately. But what I will say is that for all the difficulties that our countries are experiencing in a number of different ways, I'm quite certain that this is still, my answer to you is the best one I can give you is, I am certain that this is the only time that I would want to be alive.
And I would agree with that, Paul. I think this is the only time I would want to be alive as well right now. And going back to our concept of a golden age, part of me is tempted to say they're a political construct. Do you think golden ages are used for a political reason? Because I think different people would have different opinions on what exactly a golden age is. I think if you were to ask certain British people what was the UK's golden age, they may say Elizabethan, the classic rule Britannia phase, rule Britannia, Britannia ruled the seas, the peak of the empire, if you will, about 1600s. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, I mean, that's roughly when you're starting to talk about the first British Empire.
Yeah. Part of me would be tempted. I think a lot of people would say, but was that really a golden age? And it's this concept of a good old Britain that inspires a lot of people to do certain things, but other people with different political ideas might be like, well, that wasn't a very good time in British history. That's quite a dark time. So I think the concept of a golden age is very debated depending on a lot of things, depending on your opinions on things, because a lot of people would say we're a golden age in Britain. I personally wouldn't be too sure on that.
Golden age is definitely something, and any element of history is something that can obviously be used for a specific political purpose. But when I'm thinking of it, I'm not thinking of it in political terms per se. I'm thinking of it in terms of more timeless accomplishments. Things like culture, things like various media, books, shows, theater, various works that have been made, all of that sort of thing that add to the flavor that we come from, are various technological innovations.
The creation of the decimal system.
Yeah, that being one among many. So for me, I'm not thinking of it in a political sense whatsoever. I'm thinking more about the elements that we have created today that will last long beyond our current strife, political or otherwise. So, well, yeah, absolutely. This concept of a nostalgic greater time, a golden era, has been used for many a different purpose, politically to be most sure. When I'm answering that question, I'm thinking about it in terms of timeless achievement.
Interesting. That's a much more sensible approach to it, Paul. And I would say in that case, then quite possibly the Gupta Empire could quite unarguably be seen as a golden age, because just so much of importance to this day in India and the wider world came from there.
It is my feeling that regardless of what we look back on as a golden age, that our greatest focus should always be making today the Golden Age?
That's a very, very profound statement, Paul, especially in the heights of a pandemic. Brave stuff to say, but we are in our own special way living through a golden age right now. Golden age of information, of technology, that's for sure.
When you simply look at the various practicalities, technology, and logistics that go into this very show, and even making it possible, when you go back and you start sussing out and tweezing the various things that needed to happen in order to make this arrangement possible for even this podcast, you will be blown over. It's an intellectual exercise that I think has actually a great deal of benefit to give us a bit more perspective on where we are today. But my feeling is definitely, for all that it's worth, we should always be working to making today that golden age.
Completely, Paul. I think that's very positive of you, Paul. I think that's a bit of good old-fashioned Paul positivity is what the world could do with right now.
I can think of no higher compliment. Is that all you have for us today?
That is all I have for us today, Paul. Very excited to, as I just said, I'm very excited to introduce the Gupta Empire to the world stage, because I don't believe they're going anywhere anytime soon, if memory serves.
They got a couple of centuries ahead of them.
Yeah, so we look forward to seeing what they get up to.
I'm looking forward to it immensely, and us here, you there, we'll be back right after word from AD.
This is the AD History Podcast.
Well, that does it for us today. Patrick, where can people find us?
You can find me personally primarily on Instagram at NameExplainYT. But you can also find me on Twitter at NameExplainYT, and of course on YouTube, search NameExplain. What about you, Paul?
In addition to my usual work at TGNR at tgnreview.com, you can find me at my Twitter handle at PKD in History, as well as my reader-submitted World War II Q&A column, The World War II Brain Bucket, where I answer all World War II-related questions, which, if you are on YouTube, we will have a link down in the description.
That's all today from myself. Goodbye, thank you, and take care.
Yes, thank you all so much. Until next time.
Like all good things, we come to an end for today. Thank you for listening to the AD History Podcast. It is listeners such as yourself who make this show possible and truly awesome. Be sure to follow and subscribe for upcoming AD History Podcast episodes, available wherever podcasts are found. Also, follow AD History on social media. Follow the show on Twitter at the handle at ADHistoryPC, as well as on Facebook by visiting facebook.com/ADHistoryPodcast and Instagram as AD History Podcast. In addition to liking and subscribing on YouTube by searching AD History Podcast. Do you have a direct comment or question for Paul and Patrick? Drop them an email at adhistorypodcast@tgnreview.com. Also, be sure to visit the show's homepage at tgnreview.com/ADHistoryPodcast. For Paul and Patrick, thank you for listening to the AD History. We'll see you again next time in the ever-growing tapestry of world history.